If you just look at yours and you don't look at other people's and you don't see this is almost like a template, or like they could have just swapped out the name, and this, like, how can this story be the same story be told over and over and over again?
What I think is powerful about the TRC is that its investigations are nationally recognized, and its truths then become the basis for processes, other levers that can be utilized in order to seek reconciliation. I mean, it's one thing for an individual to conduct their own investigation, or even a scholar to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It's a completely another matter when, the nation state recognizes through its own investigations truths that maybe the society has been trying to avoid.
This is What Next, the Adoptee Rights Podcast. I'm Gregory Luce, an adoptee rights lawyer and the executive director of Adoptees United. I'm also an adopted person, born and adopted in the District of Columbia. Each episode of What Next is about adoptee rights, whether we have them, demand them, or have already secured them. I talk with a wide range of adopted people, as well as our friends and allies about issues that impact us all. This episode is the podcast version of my conversation with Jennifer Kwon Dobbs and Ryan Gustafsson as part of the Adoptees United conference in Minneapolis in July 2024. Jennifer was adopted from Korea to the United States and Ryan to Australia. And both of them, along with more than 350 other Korean adoptees, filed cases with the Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2022. The TRC, as it is known, is now investigating the country's history and operation of its vast intercountry adoption program, which began in the 1950s. It is expected to complete the investigation and issue its report in 2025. I talked with Jennifer and Ryan about their individual cases and what they think about when we talk about truth and reconciliation, both in a wider context, but more specifically in the context of illicit intercountry adoptions from their countries of birth. Jennifer started off the conversation.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Greg, for the kind introduction to be a part of this conference. It's a real joy to be here in conversation with Ryan and with all of you. I'm seeing a lot of names in the chat who I recognize, and I'm excited to be reconnecting with as well here in this space. I'm currently located in Seoul, South Korea. I just arrived about 2 days ago, and I'll be here for the month working on some projects. A little bit more about me beyond what's in the chat bio. With regard to some of the work that I've done in the past as an advocate and policy analyst, I first began my work in a grassroots sense as a member of the Truth and Reconciliation for the Adoption Community of Korea, also known as TRAC, focused on doing research, particular as a member of that core steering group, right when the organization that became KUMFA first got started and was known as Miss Mamma Mia. Some of the work that I was doing on unwed mother narratives supported TRAC's pivot then toward more investigation and unwed mother solidarity. Later on, I began working with the Korea Policy Institute as a policy analyst and fellow, where I researched North Korean adoption and traveled to North Korea a couple times to learn more about those practices, to provide a richer peninsular sense of Korean adoption. And then thirdly, I was also a lead policy analyst for Stop the Deportation of Russell Green, at the time a member of the advisory board for Adoptsource. And this particular grassroots campaign predated Adam Kasper and helped to, I think, galvanize our communities on this matter of US adoptees in particular being removed per some loopholes in the law. Most recently, I'm currently the Associate Dean of Interdisciplinary General Studies at St. Olaf College. I've been focusing on the study of musal and poetry, in particular thinking about, what could be a text that can heal our ancestors' grief within this context of truth and reconciliation. And most recently, I have edited a portfolio of adoptee writing with California Poet Laureate Lee Herrick. It was published through Liminal Magazine. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was a really terrific summary of all the things that you've done, and probably maybe missing some of those as well. So, Ryan, could you introduce yourself and maybe provide some background as sort of your interest into this area?
Yeah, just echoing Jennifer's comments. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. My name's Ryan, pronouns they, them, and he, him. I'm a Korean adoptee writer and researcher. I live in Melbourne, Australia. I've been involved in, I suppose, like adult intercountry adoptee related community projects for a little while. I formed a research network with Bunyang Han, who is one of the people that eventually, or through that engagement with her, was one of the ways in which I became more involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigation. So I can talk a little bit more about that later. So I started a research network with her and another Korean adoptee researcher. It's called the Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network. So I've been involved in that. Then with the Australia-US Korean Rights Group, or the AusKRG, which is involved in the current TRC investigation. I'm also run a podcast with a good friend called Adopted Feels, and my research in recent years has been focusing a fair bit on Korean adoptee experiences predominantly. So the historical and legal side of things is something I would very much like to learn more about, but is not sort of the main focus of the research and writing that I've been doing. But I'm really interested in how institutional processes and histories intersect with personal ones, and how that impacts, right, our sense of like who we are and how we came to be where we are. So that kind of intertwining of institutional and personal is something that I'm very interested in. And I think the TRC investigation is an example of a very clear example, right, of that intersection. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Greg.
So, just so folks know who aren't familiar, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, what is your understanding of what they are looking at? And we'll get into your personal interest in being part of those complaints. But what are they looking at? And as far as you know, where are they in this process? I mean, I know generally that I think they're on an extension of time to provide some results, but wondering, Ryan, if you could talk about sort of the history of this sort of development with the TRC.
In mid 2022, the Danish Korean Rights Group submitted their first batch of cases to Korea's current Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigative period. And that is like government mandated investigative period. I believe it is only 3 years. And it's essentially looking at human rights violations during Korea's authoritarian period. And so my understanding is that several adoptees got together, including Bunyang and Peter from the Danish Korean Rights Group, and thought about whether this would be a useful avenue to try to get more spotlight, I suppose, on Korea's overseas adoption practices. And then the Australia-US Korean Rights Group that I'm a part of, we created the group in a very, very rushed manner to essentially speed through our own applications by the time that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was closing for cases. So we submitted on the same day as the Swedish Korean Adoptee Network, I believe it's called, SKAARN. And just for a little bit of background, I won't go too much in the weeds, but essentially there are 4 major adoption agencies, right, in Korea. And the DKRG, or the Danish group, essentially represented cases from Holt and KSS. And so when I had heard about the Danish group's initiative, I was worried that my agency, Eastern Social Welfare Society, might not be included in the investigation if no one from Eastern also added their cases to the group application. And that was also the thinking of the Swedish group. So they represent social welfare society adoptees. So it was a kind of concerted effort to make sure that if the TRC were to open an investigation, that all 4 major agencies would be included. And that was hence the rush for the OzKRG to get together and put something through.
And I think that most people, I guess, in the US, not just adoptees, recognize HOLT International as one of those agencies, but I think many people don't know about all the other three. Yeah. And so was the DKRG, did that have HOLT in its purview? Yeah, all right. But the others were ones that I think many people have, other than Korean adoptees, have heard of in the past. KSS and Eastern. And then Jennifer, you were with Eastern, I believe.
Yes, I was also adopted through Eastern. I actually was placed by Eastern and Dillon Adoption Agency, which recently shuttered its doors. I was placed in Oklahoma, state of Oklahoma, and that's where I grew up, right? Maybe about 20 minutes outside Tulsa. But if it's helpful, I'd also like to say a little bit more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a framework within a South Korean context. Here the TRC first emerged to actually investigate what are called in a Korean context chinaparin, which are the Japanese collaborators during the period of colonization in Korea. And this independent body was established to be able to document cases, to be able then to present its findings, and then to move toward accountability using the levers of government. And I became interested in a TRC process as I was learning more about the work of this investigative body. And some of this work in particular, I think, had inspired some European adoptees, in particular Tobias Hübinette and Kim Sue Rasmussen, who's a Danish adoptee. And the two of them became quite curious, along with Han Boon Young, and developing professional connections with some of the members of the TRC, sort of thinking about, well, how could that potentially be a framework to enable investigations into what's happening with overseas adoption. In particular, at the time, during the early aughts, the early 2000s, there wasn't documented evidence. There were community stories of orphan switching, of adoptees doing birth search during those early periods. In particular, I'm thinking about the pioneering work, or the trailblazing work, really, of Kimura Biol. Here, Stark Kim, another identity, artist identity, oftentimes. But here, thinking specifically about the ways that our stories, our searches were uncovering all of these irregularities, all of this corruption, and the possibilities of a TRC as it was first emerging through this idea of the investigative body looking at the Chinapain, the Japanese collaborators. When I was learning more about the TRC process, I did discover some connections with adoption, in particular Kim Dae-sik, who was the president of HOLT during the 80s, HOLT Korea, and how he had actually been in the final documents that the investigative body turned over to the government to show, like, look, here is the official list of all of the Japanese collaborators through our investigative labors. Kim Dae-sik had actually been a Japanese collaborator who had been training and organizing these military bodies up in, at the time, had been called Manchukuo, and actually doing heinous crimes against Koreans in that area. So there is this interplay here historically between this adoption and some of these gross atrocities that are riddled throughout Korean history, going back as early as that. At one time, in some of the initial lists that were published by this iteration, the first iteration of the TRC, the president of ESWS, Kim Dak-wang, his name had actually also been included. So his name was not in the final documents, but I'd be curious about why.
Right. I mean, obviously, it's a huge development to have these cases filed, but it sounds as if there was a lot of steps along the way until, and I imagine it's not one person, but it's many people who realize we have an ability to file a claim within this commission, and it's within their purview, and they're then mandated to investigate. And I'm wondering where in that whole process Ryan mentioned that it was kind of a rush process, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this, to make sure that all the agencies, the major agencies, were represented. But was there an aha moment along that where you say, yes, this would be a viable route to take? Let's try to go through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission based upon what you just talked about, the historical, investigations that they had done in the past. Was there ever an aha moment for either one of you? It's like, oh, I got to be part of that. It sounds like Brian there was, because it's like, hey, my agency's not included.
I think for me that I don't know if it was an aha moment so much as like, like I think there's a rich history of Korean adoptee activism as Jennifer is also like can speak to much more than I can. But that this is a culmination of like a lot of work and conversations and stories that have been told. It was more for me like, well, let's try it because without, knowing whether or not the TRC would view it as a kind of case that they would take on. And I think there was a lot of uncertainty around that, but it was like a potential strategy. So let's just give it a go kind of thing. I suppose like politically important that Eastern was included, that like
Mhm.
that if it were to work out, that I think I would have really regretted it if the 3 out of 4 major agencies were included and Eastern wasn't. It just wouldn't have felt right. I think that was the main push for me. And I think connecting it more to like my personal circumstances or my own history, like I think that came later. I think and at the end of 2022, it was like, we just have to do this. And then I think the like kind of personal emotional repercussions of that didn't really sink in till a bit later.
Wait, and so the commission had sort of a deadline they had in which this was closing, and then you got the cases in. Obviously, how close to that deadline? Pretty close.
I think it was the last day.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
Jennifer, I remember we were on a joint video call, and I think you were watching them file the papers. It's not the most. It's exciting personally for you, I'm sure. It's not the most exciting thing to see people filing papers, but it was very meaningful, I assume, to you and others to see that actually happen. And so I had no idea that was the last day that you could do that.
It was deeply meaningful, and I think again because I have this longer view of knowing how fragile the TRC, going back to its early days, in that first iteration where it was actually at one point discontinued by a conservative government that was then elected. It was really through grassroots fundraising that the TRC was able to continue its work. And then later it was completely shut down, but then it was reactivated when there was more left-leaning government that was elected into office after the conservative one was no longer in power. And I think it was in 2020 when the TRC was relaunched. And that's the version, right, that Ryan, as you're talking about in 2022, and then with what's happening right now, its mandate. I may be getting this wrong, but I think it's been for like about 3 to 4 years, right? And so we were able to slide in right at the very last moment.
Hmm.
So I want to be clear about like how going from, that early time period that I was describing to, most recently with our cases, that's not been this clean line. It's really been a complex process. So knowing how fragile that work is as a context, and also thinking too about how a struggle, I think, and, there are a lot of activists on this call who, have a lot of deep knowledge, and I hope during the Q&A they'll share their thoughts about this as well. But, at least from my view as someone who's worked transnationally over the years, a lot of the struggle has been in trying to get the Korean society to see why they should care about overseas adoption from Korea, rather than seeing it as kind of a foreigner issue. And here thinking back to, again, the 2010s, and, the struggle was really to get the Koreans to see how we weren't outside of history, that we were a part of their history, that we're a part of our history as a larger understanding of Korea. So to me, to see, that very banal moment of papers being filed and then to have cases accepted was just a deeply emotional moment.
I bet. Yeah. What does it look like to put together a case? Like, I mean, you had to rush through it, but I imagine it. I mean, I remember talking to you at one point, Jennifer, and it sounded fairly complicated to put together what sounds like a narrative and trying to figure out the narrative that would fit into the what a case would file would look like. What did it look like putting it together individually? Like, what did it involve?
I think Ryan can also speak to this too, and I'm going to really just give a lot of gratitude to the organizing work of the AAUS KRG for making the process as quick as it had to be, for making it be as intentional, as possible, and for really creating a space of care for one another. But, speaking specifically for myself, it was about filing a form that was provided by the TRC, and also developing a narrative history. And, I think because of my search having taken place for 13 years and going back and forth, and really being ugly aggressive with Eastern, I was able to, get a lot of documentation in place. And I had a lot of paperwork. I think I ended up filing not only, I think it was a 7 or 8 page single spaced narrative that I typed up, but also a set of attachments that were almost 100 pages of documents in Korean and English, which just goes to show how substantial our files truly are, how they're thick. They're not like these single pieces of paper that are sometimes shown to us.
So these are papers that you had pursued. These documents are things that you pursued over the years, culminating in essentially your ability to create a narrative out of what you were at least reading, whether it's true or not, but creating that narrative out of that.
Yes, that's true. And, as I think is oftentimes the case, just learning from other adoptees over the years, how to even do that, how to even read these weird pieces of paper that were never meant to be used or read in any way other than to erase, send us away, with the intention that it was a one-way ticket, right, to
Right.
the receiving country. So, sort of misreading these documents in ways that could also be then cross-checked with other adoptees' papers, and then sort of learning through this kind of literacy, I don't know what else to call it, of this kind of cross-checking, sort of discovering those irregularities or those moments that kind of make you pause and want to investigate further. So
And Ryan, I believe you're part of many things. You're a poet. What was your relationship to the documents and creating a narrative from those documents? Was it
Um,
similar to what Jennifer's talking about? Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine looking. I mean, we all, as adoptees, whether you're domestic or intercountry, the documents tell a story. You don't know if it's true or not. And you kind of refabricate your history based upon those documents. So I'm wondering what your narrative looked like as you tried to put it together. But you're also, like, guess looking forward to see, trying to convince the TRC to take the case as well. And so wondering what that process was like for you.
Part of the putting together the application was this, like we have strong reasons to suspect XYZ, right? Like, and we think therefore that you should open an investigation because we have reasons to believe this, is a widespread issue. I think I I had my initial social history, which is what Eastern called the like 2.5 page document, whatever that we were given. I think of what helped put together the narrative from me was, I suppose, the involvement and conversations I've had with like so many adoptees in the research I'd been doing, right? Which is like, if you just look at yours and you don't look at other people's and you don't see, this is almost like a template, or like they could have just swapped out the name, and this, like, how can this story be the same story be told over and over and over again? In 1985, when I was adopted, right, there was just under 9,000 of us that were sent from Korea that year, right? So like that's a very strong story that serves a particular purpose, and that purpose was to facilitate adoption. I think it's been a powerful realization for me. Like, it sounds very obvious when I think about it now, right? But having to reflect on, like, I think a lot of us look to our adoption papers for a trace of our history or for the identities of our birth families. And I think, like, as Jenna pointed out too, right, like that's not the purpose those documents serve, right? They served a very particular one, but if that's all we have to go on, that's what we look to try and put together a story, which we know is probably has elements of inaccuracies, and just trying to learn to live with all those unknowns, I think is very taxing, right? It's tiring, and frustrating. And I think it was the knowledge that had been generated in the adoptee community that also made me feel more confident, right, about putting in my very patchy narrative to the TRC. Just knowing that, like, if mine sits alongside hundreds of others, like, it's going to tell a larger story, even if my own story is super patchy and I can't prove much. I felt like I couldn't have done this without the others. I don't have a strong evidence base for my claims. I don't think my birth mother would be willing to speak to the TRC to give her testimony. So I'm just only able to write down, what I was told the first and only time that I met her. But that's, just my memory, and that's all I can really put in that document.
So, I mean, yeah, it sounds like, I shouldn't say basically, it sounds as if this is collective power. That's essentially the only way this kind of came together, was the ability for all of you to at least share your own stories, recognize all the missing pieces or falsities or patterns, and putting together a really strong case. But not, what's interesting is just for you to say your patchy history, but it is that history, but it's also these other numbers of histories of other people and their narratives as well. And that collective power somehow came together here. And I imagine that's the first part of this commission is truth. You're seeking truth. And what powers do you have, even any idea what powers they have to determine that truth, and what you may want to see from any findings that they make? Is that something within something you've sort of imagined? We'll get to reconciliation, because I think that's a really fascinating, tough subject to take on, but I'm wondering what truths you would like to see. Jennifer, why don't you take that if you feel comfortable?
Yeah. What I think is powerful about the TRC is that its investigations are nationally recognized, and its truths then become the basis for processes, other levers that can be utilized in order to seek reconciliation. I mean, it's one thing for an individual to conduct their own investigation, or even a scholar to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It's a completely another matter when, the nation state recognizes through its own investigations truths that maybe the society has been trying to avoid. I'm not necessarily arguing that the nation state is the answer, and be really clear about that. That is very problematic for a plethora of reasons. But what I do want to get at, though, is it can be a starting place for a kind of amplification, and even maybe a transnational set of conversations that just the individual working, even no matter how resourced they are, would not be able necessarily to enact or manifest. Other thing that's, I think, important to point out too is that it's not, at least speaking for myself here, for me, the TRC isn't just about the truth about my identity. Again, I'm trying to think more about those larger processes here that are structural, and that also touch the lives of Koreans within the peninsula, North and South Korea. And here, in particular, thinking about the corruptions on the part of the actors that the TRC are aiming to hold accountable. I'm thinking about how, in my particular case at ESWS, a way that an emergency orphan hojak could be fabricated was because of I forget the name in Korean of the particular paper, but it was through the courts where there was an emergency order released saying, that I was a foundling who was failing to thrive. And therefore, I needed an emergency custodian. And that person was Kwon, president of ESWS. And that particular paper served as the critical lie that then looped me into ESWS's set of processes for adoption. Never mind the fact that I was forwarded from an orphanage and I had been taken from my mother at the age of 2 weeks, and that she had been looking for me and that my father had been as well. It was that paper from the court, the emergency order, failure to thrive, that then released all of these so-called emergency processes to aim to get me to thrive, and that was through adoption. So I can't help but wonder again, like, that legal process, how has that mechanism been used over and over again for the kind of template that Ryan had named earlier? That template isn't just about boilerplate for identity for its own sake. It is also at the same time boilerplate in the sense of processes that are happening rapidly in order to facilitate the mass removal of children.
Sounds so familiar, even, I mean, not just in Korea, but all over the world, and how many children are treated ideologically, and how how family policing or family regulation or whatever it's called in each country is used to separate children from their parents. Yeah, so Ryan, truth. I mean, when you talk about truth, I mean, what meaning does that have to you in this context? Because I mean, I just love Jennifer's explanation of that. I think it was just powerful. But I'm curious to what you think.
For me, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but all 4 major adoption agencies in Korea are private. So there's just so much to understand and uncover around like financial interests, day-to-day administration. And that's something that we pushed hard for in the group application, that should be a matter of public record, in addition to all of our so-called personal documents, like that we need to understand how Eastern ran and the links that Eastern had with government. That also feels incredibly important to our history, right? Because that forms our history. And yeah, for me, truth would be the release and acknowledgement of how things ran, how they made decisions, like why Eastern sent X amount to Australia and over 30,000 to the US, but not to other countries except for Switzerland. But that was because I think the ambassador wanted to just adopt 4 children. So Eastern only dealt with Australia, US, and Switzerland that one time. Yeah, that there's just so many unanswered questions, I suppose, to the history of Eastern and what enabled the mass movement of over 200,000 of us. That feels incredibly important, not just for adoptees, but also, as Jennifer said, right, for Korean society to grapple with. And it feels really important that this, I mean, even though we've talked a lot like amongst ourselves about the importance of the TRC for us and what it might uncover for us to better understand our histories. But it does feel important that it's Korean society deciding to look at their own history and practices and hopefully at some point integrate adoption history into their understanding of themselves. And also goes without saying that if there's 200,000 of us, more than, I don't know how one does the math, but that impacted like thousands and thousands and thousands of Korean families.
Right.
And that also needs to be brought to light.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. About this doesn't just involve, I don't think it does, adopted people. It involves, you hope, investigation of how the mothers were treated at the time and the mechanisms that existed to, whether it's overt or more, I guess, private, to get them to relinquish children. I'm just fascinated by the truth being not only about whatever truth you can get for yourself, if any, but the truth of the mechanism, which I think would be fascinating and very meaningful to understand. and or sort of almost an admission that this is the mechanism that made all of this happen. And as you say, all the players involved in that as well.
Yeah, Greg, just briefly, for me, it's the mechanisms and the entanglements. And here I'm thinking about, and I think this was also a part of the application with regard to, I'm not sure if it's part of AUSKRG, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm thinking about the entanglement between this adoption and also the work camps like Brothers Home, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which the financial entanglements aren't just about trying to extract maximum fees through intercountry adoption, but also to how the entanglements with like the work camps that were during the dictatorships help us to understand how this adoption was actually helping a war effort, a military dictatorship at home. And then thinking too about how this adoption touches the lives of the children of adoptees, how it touches the lives not only of unwed mothers, but also the lives of all parents and all of our relations. In the sense that Korean family, I know it's become increasingly about the nuclear family, but in the generation in which I've been sent overseas in the 1970s, the shift, during the dictatorship hadn't quite yet all the way been completed to where nuclear family was the only context. So that when I reunited, it was about also seeing the loss that my aunts and uncles and cousins had also experienced. So when we start to think about all of those entanglements and all of those connections that have been violently pulled apart and how they affect generations going forward with regard to our descendants, and also thinking backward with regard to our ancestors, the trauma of that just violence, I think, becomes much more apparent.
Yeah.
I think it's that recognition that I'm hoping.
Yeah, as I listen to you, I can see how meaningful that would be. And even thinking of myself and how the mechanisms of how you came to exist and the place in the world you are now being so important to understand. Which it also sort of gets to the next part of the mission of the commission is reconciliation. When you have all these ramifications from the act of removing a child from their parent or having a government sanctioned process to do that, what does reconciliation? I mean, what's interesting is you're both scholars and researchers, and the reconciliation is both almost a scholarly pursuit in some ways. It's kind of theoretical in some ways, but this is not theoretical. And so I'm wondering what reconciliation looks like to you, if you can imagine it. I mean, I'm just having a hard time imagining reconciliation in this context and what it means and what it looks like. Have you been able to imagine that? Or is there something that you actually specifically asked for in the application that would involve reconciliation?
There's some things that we asked for example, that all adoptees' documents be transferred to the National Center for the Rights of the Child, which is the government-owned agency. So this is like in addition, right, to investigating the hundreds of individual cases that have been filed. We also ask that Eastern transfer all the more administrative, right, documentation that they have as well to the NCRC, and that resources and data sets be made publicly available so that not just adoptees, but also, right, other Koreans living in Korea might be able to access and understand that. I think, yeah, it feels really important that this is a grappling that Korean society does, like amongst themselves as much as we do from abroad. I think the question of what reconciliation might mean for the community is a very difficult one. I also have trouble envisioning what that might be, and I guess that also maybe brings me to like another point that I just want to like add really quick is that because we rushed to submit the cases by the deadline and we had very little time to do so, the OSKRG lodged 16 cases and a group case. that obviously is a tiny, 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 tiny slice of the amount of adoptees that would have liked to have been involved, would have liked to have lodged a case as well. And so I think a group is trying to, stay connected, I suppose, with other adoptees in the community and try and always have that front of mind that whatever reconciliation might look like for the TRC, that we want to ensure that the scope is broadened, that it doesn't, not that we're acting on behalf of, but just to kind of keep that front of mind that this obviously impacts thousands of us, way, way more than the couple hundred that manage to file cases. So that feels important as we move forward toward envisioning what reconciliation might look like, that we try and, I don't know, take others with us, I guess.
Hmm. Jennifer, I'm just curious what you would, I mean, you often hear of reparation, you hear of restoration, but this is reconciliation. And I'm wondering what that term means to you in this context.
And I think with other contexts of, TRCs, I'm thinking about, the stolen generations, which maybe Ryan can speak to as well, in Australia. Also Mothers of Cinco de Mayo, thinking about TRC cases that happened there. I think a state mandated apology is not the end goal.
Right.
I think sometimes official state apologies kind of shut down any kind of reconciliation. Sometimes those apologies can be utilized as kind of endpoint on the part of the state to argue that, okay, now the work is done. The Korean adoptee diasporas received an apology from Kim Dae-jung that was a personal apology, and that the president invited a group of adoptees to the Blue House and issued an apology. When he had been in exile, he had met a number of Korean adoptees in Europe, just as part of his experiences. In a sense, there has been a kind of apology, but in my view, because I'm thinking about, the children of adoptees, I'm thinking about ancestors as well. Would reconciliation look like, the children of adoptees and their rights, their abilities to get information? Currently, they're not permitted to do birth search, although they have a stake, right, in wanting to know a family. When it comes to ancestors, would it look like adoptees being added to Jokbo and the ancestral registries that all of us have and may not even be aware of necessarily? Would it look like being restored in that regard, or would it look like, having our identities, here I'm thinking about my particular case of how my Korean name is Hasujin, it is not Kwon Young-mi. I've been reluctant to pursue citizenship as Kwon Young-mi because I don't want to provide any kind of authority to a fabricated identity, but I understand that fabricated identity marks me as adopted. Is there a way to pursue citizenship through the identity that my Korean family gave me and, through blended kinship, I continue to live as? So I'm not sure what the mechanisms would be, but I think, as Ryan pointed out, for the community, I think reconciliation is going to be very individualized, very also at the same time, deeply personal. Maybe as writers, Ryan, as poets, we can envision possibilities, right, as well. I think there's probably work that literature and art, this kind of cultural work can also do, that individual readers, can turn to in ways that are important to them.
Right. I see why you two are involved with your research, but also the poetry you both write and the writings that you have. These are deep, hard concepts to figure out. I'm wondering is part of the process of the TRC to involve those who have filed cases or maybe even beyond in coming up with, call it a remedy, call it reconciliation, whatever you want to call it. But is that part of the process that they may follow, or they have the authority to follow? It's like, okay, here is the truth. Let's collectively try to figure out what with your input and your involvement, what we can do to reconcile this truth.
I mean, in terms of the TRC in its first iteration, when it was investigating, documenting cases of Chinapa in, it released then an encyclopedia with, the names in the final list and entries for each one. And not only was there this multi-volume set, but there was also an app where you could access those findings very easily. And those findings, I think, had also been used for lawsuits against some of the individuals. There had been sort of this like well-known but undocumented fact that a number of the chaebols here, the corporate conglomerates, a number of them have entanglements or roots in Japanese collaboration. And so to actually have that investigated and documented with some of the names that were part of that final record provides an unquestionable foundation for other kinds of remedies that would not have been possible otherwise. So I can't help but think that similarly, there's going to be a foundation here that is unquestionable that will help provide groundwork for reconciliation efforts through different ways that the communities imagine it within the adoptee diasporas.
Ryan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that whole, whether others are going to be involved in trying to create a remedy or if the commission really creates it itself. It sounds like you've asked for that, but whether they can do that, I don't know.
I'm unclear on what that part of the process might look like and like how involved we might be in that. I wonder too, like I don't know much at all about domestic adoption in Korea, but another thing that could certainly happen is that this then prompts an investigation of, because I mean, Eastern adopted in Korea as well as it holds. So this investigation could also, I mean, if we're implicating Eastern and the other agencies in, if, those are found to be true, those violations found to be true, then undoubtedly they impacted domestic adoption practices as well. It's the same agencies. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of gets sparked by the results.
Just briefly, I do want to point out too that on the receiving country side, that as a result of the TRC investigation currently underway, investigations have been launched on the receiving country side into Korean adoption. And I think, Ryan, correct me again if I'm wrong, or anybody also on this call, but I believe that Sweden has shut down its Korean adoption program as a consequence. So we're already seeing some incredible results here from the investigation just being underway. And I can't help but imagine that maybe one consequence would be more and more receiving countries on that side of things just shutting down their Korean adoption programs, or maybe even on the Korean side of it just shutting down overseas adoption as well as a consequence of international pressure.
Right. And it seems like that is the trend, that we're seeing with the receiving countries, especially the European countries. I'm wondering in that aspect, and Jennifer, you're one of a few U.S. Korean adoptees to file a case. I mean, is the U.S. always seems untouchable in this? I'm not sure why. Why? I mean, I guess I could understand why they feel that they're untouchable, but as a receiving country and the largest receiving country of Korean adoptees, why are they always not getting more focus on their practices? I mean, as compared to Europe, Netherlands, Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden. Yeah,
that's a great question, Greg. And I can't help but think that as a consequence of some of your work too, the adoptee rights law, you probably have some insights as well. But like when it comes to this matter of the TRC, I think what has been incredibly frustrating, just in the bit of research that I've done, is like there's not a mechanism, it seems to me, to move beyond just say like submitting an individual complaint under the Hague Convention through the US State Department. I mean, the time when there was a hearing, congressional hearings around anything having to do with Korean adoption has been around, the support, trying to get groundswell support for amending the child adoption law, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or the citizenship law. Jet lag, I'm forgetting the name of it. Help me out, Greg.
Child Citizenship Act, yeah, or
Thank
Adoptee
you.
Citizenship Act of 2024, or even prior. Yeah, exactly.
Yep, thank you for that. Right. So, having a congressional hearing in support of a law or some kind of resolution could maybe be a remedy, but operating through the State Department, it seems like it's really just an individual complaint.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine the mechanisms look very different. In Australia, I think, Ryan, you've shared in the AUS-KRG chat about how you and other activists in Australia have been able to have meetings even with the Australian government. Is that correct?
Yes, limited, but one of the things that we tried to do once our cases were accepted by the TRC was to then put pressure on the Australian government to also launch an investigation, as well as the US government. But I mean, that just seems, yeah, I don't know how one gets that going. The Australian authorities have been interested in, like, okay, well, how's the investigation going? They have not been particularly interested in, like, yes, we should also launch something from our side, but I think we'll have an opportunity when the TRC delivers their results to push for that again.
Right.
And there's also been a bit more media interest in Australia on Korea's overseas adoption system, and that's been very much driven by the TRC.
How much of it is, I mean, I always think that some politics is driven by embarrassing the state. And I'm wondering how much of that is involved in Korea, that the state or the government is embarrassed by its history and what it's done. In the US, doesn't seem to ever get embarrassed. Or if they do, they try to cover it up. I'm wondering, activism involves embarrassing or calling out or pushing for things that put these issues into the light. I'm wondering if that's part of the process of the advocacy you've had, is to try to highlight these things and, in fact, embarrass the government, what they've done in the past. Is that too crude of a term?
I mean, I think that shame is powerful, especially in a Korean context. Think in a US context.
I don't think it goes anywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
I think our pause may be very articulate right now,
Right.
as we both kind of had this incredulous look.
Right.
But I think on the Korean side of things and my transnational experiences, there's just a longer set of maybe histories around how these lies, this corruption, holding governments accountable, the power of shame to make those corruptions visible, that comes out of the democratic work, in particular against dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
How there are these cultural forces that enable holding governments accountable through cultural performances that get at shaming those corrupt actors. And I think that has been a powerful context for some of the cultural work I know that I've been a part of as a transnational adopted person, doing street performances when I was a member of TRAC, showing up and interrupting the grand opening of, what one of the very earlier iterations of the NCRC, when they really had, I think they were called KAARN when they were launching. And how those kinds of cultural interventions can make visible how there's no there, or how there are corrupt entanglements. And how that work is steeped within larger democracy movements within the Korean context that have used this kind of cultural work and the shaming strategy as a way of, again, holding actors accountable.
Yeah, and we're going to open up for questions here in a second. But for me, it's just, I keep coming back to the power of storytelling and what you have done to tell your stories and collect them and use them as collective power. And I think that's really what it's at its root. And what you also, I think, highlighted was stories that go back decades. So when you talk about the activism you did maybe a decade or more ago, that is all part of where this leads to today. And we need to continue to tell those stories, especially as we all get older. I mean, I'm getting older in this work, and there's many younger adoptees. And I was talking to our board chair, CS, who feels that the storytelling is very important, so that younger adoptees understand where this history comes from and what context we can imagine for the future. So I really appreciate talking about your stories. And I'm sure sometimes it gets exhausting to talk about them all the time, and also putting it in a formal complaint to the government. So I really appreciate the work that you've done. I know that, Jennifer, you just got into Korea maybe a day or two ago, so you're dealing with some jet lag, and Ryan, I really appreciate you putting your story out there as well and sharing with us what you're doing. It does sound very complicated. I really appreciate sharing this, and look forward to, maybe less than a year from now, we'll get some good news out of the TRC, I hope.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks so much, Greg.
What Next is a production of Adoptees United, Inc., a national nonprofit organization dedicated to equality for all adopted people. It is produced and hosted by me, Gregory Luce. Check out our past episodes and subscribe to any future episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, any donations to Adoptees United are tax deductible. So consider supporting this work by donating to Adoptees United at adopteesunited.org/donate. See you next time.